Last week I did a video talking about a parameter on our Helix called sag, kind of what I refer to as the deeper functions of the Helix. These functions that are not just the normal drive and treble, bass, mid, presence controls that we're also used to seeing on the front of normal tube amps, and probably the first controls that we reach for on our Helix when we're dialing in a preset. When we get into these deeper functions, there's a couple parameters in there that can really determine what our tone is going to end up sounding like, which can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on whether we know what we're doing and we know what the outcome's going to be before we even move those parameters. So a good understanding of those parameters is very important to being able to come up with a tone very quickly and effortlessly. Now, in my experience in talking to a lot of folks, many people are afraid of those parameters. They don't know what they do. They don't want to touch them. Even though we could always just return it to the same setting we had it at before, there seems to be something that's a little overwhelming about them. So I like to do these videos to maybe nudge people in the direction of trying out these parameters and realizing that there's a lot of great tones in there, and maybe tones that we at first didn't think could be great, but maybe something that's different than what we would normally lean towards dialing in. So today, we're not talking about sag anymore. We're going to talk about the bias control. Now, first and foremost, I don't want to go really in depth as to what bias is, but bias has to do with the amount of voltage that's going to be running through our power tubes in their idle state when we're not playing. This can affect a number of things in a real world tube amp, such as tube life. If we are running less voltage through in the idle state, our tubes will last longer, but maybe we won't get the tone we wanted them. If we're running too much voltage through them, our tubes will burn out faster. And as far as I understand, can even cause damage to some other components in our amplifier. So we don't necessarily in the real world have the luxury of running our bias at any extreme settings without some maybe unintended consequences that aren't going to be too nice. But in the digital virtual world, we can do whatever we want, and the Helix has this bias control. So let's dive over, and today I'm going to be using Helix Native, so if you see the little meters going on it, I'm not using HX Edit, I'm using Helix Native, so that's why you see it there. I always get questions after the fact, how do you have meters on your HX Edit? I don't. I'm no different than anybody else. So we're using Helix Native today, but let's go over there and take a look and see what we can do with this bias control. So here we are over in a little preset that I just called bias, and all I have is a Brit Trem Norm amplifier with a 412 greenback 25 with a 57 dynamic 4 inches back. And it sounds kind of like this. Now that's a little bit loud, and you're going to know why in a second. Well, what happens with the bias control? Well, a lot of times we see it'll pop up set around 5 or 5.5 as the default setting, and most of the times we just leave it there, and it's going to be fine if we do. It's not going to be the biggest deal in the world. We're probably going to be able to dial in a great tone, but what happens when we push this to extremes? The biggest problem, I think, that most people who try it, they miss out on something that's going to be absolutely necessary to do to really understand what it's doing to the tone. And this is something I touched on in the video about the sag control. Watch what happens if we set the bias to 0, and I have it set up on snapshots. Here's what the tone is like. Watch what happens when I jump up the bias on 10. There's a massive volume jump. So what is happening here? Well, bias on 0 means that we are mimicking the sound of a cold biased amp where there's less voltage running through the tubes in their idle state. And on 10, there's going to be more voltage. So we're getting this big jump in volume. So the problem is we do that, we don't really know what we're hearing. What's happening is what we're hearing is being overshadowed by this huge volume difference. And, anybody who knows anything about audio, usually the human ear tends to gravitate towards thinking that the louder sound is quote unquote better, whatever that means. But at the bare minimum, we aren't hearing the actual difference between that parameter unless we equalize the volume between them. So what I did here is I set up another preset, and you'll notice I have both channel volume and bias snapshot enabled. So if I go to bias 0, you'll notice that I bumped the channel volume up, which only affects the volume, doesn't affect the tone at all. And then if I go to bias 10, the channel volume goes way down to 5.1, and it equalizes the volume between those. And I also have a bias set at 5, where I use the channel volume to balance that, and a bias set at 3. So we can make some comparisons here. Notice the channel volume jumps up to 7.2. So what we're going to be hearing in my examples today are nothing but the actual difference to what bias is doing and getting rid of that other variable about the volume jumping. Now, one thing I forgot to mention in the sag video, the sag control, the bias control, these are going to be controls that affect the power tubes in an amp. So in our case, the virtual power tubes, which is going to be controlled by the master volume. The master volume is the volume that's going to control how much those power tubes are working and how much saturation we're going to get from them. So any of the changes we make to these settings, sag included, are going to be more noticeable when the master is set to higher settings. So you'll notice in this video, I have the master cranked up to 10. So we're going to hopefully hear the biggest change. So we come over to bias 5, which is, I think, around the default setting for this. And this is the sound we have. Nice little tone, very usable. Okay, so watch what happens now when we go to bias 10. Do you notice a bit of a softening of the tone? There's a little less overdrive, a little less distortion, and it's a little bit of a softer feel to it. Now, I'm not here to tell you whether one of these settings is better or worse or good or bad. That's all going to be very subjective. This is more about just knowing what do these controls do. Depending on the situation we're in and what tone we need, having the knowledge of what these controls do going into it gives us another set of parameters where we can really fine-tune our tone to accomplish our end goals much quicker, and maybe just accomplish our end goals where we were struggling to get that tone without knowing what these controls do. So now let's go from bias 10, then like I've said, I've balanced the volumes between these, down to bias 0, and I think you're going to be quite shocked. We've basically forced a little more distortion out of this amp model that we had before, even at bias 5. Now the question is whether it's the type of distortion we were hoping for. It's kind of a fizzy, buzzy distortion. Definitely going to cut more through the mix. Listen to the bottom end. So it's really going to be up to us to decide which one we like the best. But now that the volumes are balanced between those, we can really tune in our ear to what the tonal difference is between these. And we don't have to worry about, are we going to lose tube life? Who cares? We're in the virtual world. We can do whatever we want. So, maybe instead of reaching for the presence control and cranking that up to get more bite, and then we go, it's actually not working the way I wanted it to now. What if we were to do something like, here we are on the sort of default setting of bias 5, and we want a little bit more cut out of it. What if I went to the bias 3? Now, one thing you'll notice on my cab is that I have the high and low cuts turned off. Now, the normal setting on those are 80 hertz on the low cut and 8 kilohertz on the high cut, but I wanted you to really hear that fizz on top. But what if we were to have those default settings on? Would it tame some of those fizzy highs and actually make it even more usable? So here with those default cuts on, there's our default bias 5. So you can see with those low and high cuts, it actually takes away maybe some of the real extreme fizziness and allows us to utilize that bias control to either smooth that tone out, get a little bit less overdrive, or maybe eke out a little more drive out of that amp model, but a little more bite. And like I said, fizziness that we can maybe control with the high cuts. Definitely going to cut nicely in a mix. Now we can also use this along with the sag control and say, what if we were to, go 0 on the bias and crank that sag up? Or the opposite. We can see how you can really use this to fine tune and dial in very nice details that maybe we didn't know that we had control over in our amp models. So what do you guys think? I hope that that was useful and enjoyable at the bare minimum. I know a lot of folks already know about these parameters, but I do get tons of questions about these. And I figure the best way is to just shoot a video giving sound examples in the proper way. Like I said, balancing volumes. I can't stress that enough. Anytime you're going to go with extremes with any of these parameters to really see what the difference is between them, it's a real must to listen to see if there's any dramatic or even small volume difference between the extremes and then compensate for that somehow so that we're really able to tune our ear in to what that parameter is doing and not just be fooled into thinking we like one versus the other because of a volume difference. So very, very important point. So what do you guys think? Do you like the cold bias? Do you like the hot bias? Do you like it set more somewhere in the middle on those kind of default settings? Well, it's really going to depend on the situation and what tone we're trying to get, but at least now we have a good understanding of what it does to the tone, and we can go into it feeling maybe a little bit more confident that we can move that around and get the results we want. So I hope that that was useful to some folks out there. Please like the video and share it with anybody who you think would get some use or at least enjoyment out of watching it. And also subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. And I'll be back really soon with some more. Thank you guys again so much for sharing your time with me. Ciao for now.